This week, we're going to look at some criticisms that have been made of the poverty of the stimulus argument, or specific instances of that argument, and as well as responses to those criticisms. So, again, just like in the sort of critical period for second language acquisition unit, we're going to be going through some back and forths here where somebody proposes something and somebody else says, no, you did that wrong, and then there's a response to the response. We're going to learn some interesting things about the empirical facts about poverty of the stimulus in the course of this. We'll also have some interesting ideas introduced and elaborated on. And the particular two papers I'll be talking about in this set of slides are Pullum and Scholz 2002, which criticizes a number of different poverty of the stimulus arguments, as well as Legate and Yang, which is a response to the Pullum and Scholz paper defending one particular poverty of the stimulus argument and introducing some very interesting empirical advances along the way. And so, in order to understand these slides, you're going to have to be familiar with the auxiliary fronting poverty of the stimulus argument. This is the one that was discussed in the last set of slides, as well as the Crane and Nakayama paper. And so this was the poverty of the stimulus argument that was about one kind of structure dependence. So when you form yes-no questions in English, you have to produce some sort of an auxiliary verb at the beginning of a sentence. Do you know Jonah? As opposed to the corresponding declarative, you do know Jonah. The claim is that which auxiliary gets fronted is a matter of syntactic structure and never a matter of linear order within the sentence, and that there's no way for children to have learned that at a very young age from their linguistic input, from the primary linguistic data they're exposed to. Therefore, they must have had some sort of bias towards structure dependent generalizations in their grammar. That's the basic idea here. And so Pullum and Scholz talk about poverty of the stimulus more generally, not just this auxiliary fronting example, although it's the auxiliary fronting one that generated a lot of follow-up back and forth. So we're going to focus on that. But they're writing more generally about poverty of the stimulus arguments. And what they're doing here is taking exception with the way that linguists have advanced the poverty of the stimulus argument. So they're explicitly not claiming that the poverty of the stimulus is wrong or that universal grammar is wrong. That's not what they're saying in their paper. What they're saying is that the arguments we've been given for the poverty of the stimulus, starting with Chomsky and continuing with his students and disciples, that these are not good arguments, that the arguments are not valid and they don't show what people are saying that they show. Right? This is the claim of Pullum and Scholz, that we shouldn't just blindly accept these poverty of the stimulus arguments because they have problematic aspects. Right? A bit later, we're going to take a look at this paper by Legate Yang, arguing that these people's argument that linguists' arguments are bad is bad. Right? So this is the kind of level we're getting into here. But for now, let's see what Pullum and Scholz have to say. And this paper does a really nice job of clarifying the nature of poverty of the stimulus arguments and the kinds of empirical evidence that they rely on and that they should rely on. So regardless of what you think about whether Pullum and Scholz are right, it's definitely a very useful paper that teaches us a lot. Right? It's also, there's one more aspect of this paper that I should disclose here. In my opinion, this is a great example of how not to write in academia. Right? The tone throughout this paper is really dismissive, sarcastic, condescending, and just mean. Right? It's a mean, sort of rough paper. And that's going to be maybe gratifying or pleasant to people who already agree with you and want to see those Chomskyians get their due because they're jerks. But this way of arguing is guaranteed to anger people who didn't start out agreeing with you. And it's really, in the end, it's counterproductive to your own point to use this kind of a tone when you're arguing. And as if it turns out, as is arguably the case with this paper, that your arguments are not quite as solid and airtight as you thought they were, then it really makes you look like a jerk. And so Jeff Pullum, honestly, is famous for writing in this way. He's just a well-known crank and jerk within the field, and this is why. He's a very smart guy, and he's made interesting contributions to linguistics, but the thing that comes along with that is that anytime you mention his name, people think about this writing style and they're like, gosh, I don't want to talk to that guy. So that's my public service announcement. Don't be a super over-aggressive linguist when you write. Here, according to Pullum Scholz, is what the structure of a poverty of the stimulus argument is like in rhetorical form. And so they're trying to split out each of the logical steps of the argument and even labeling them with their classical names from rhetoric for different kinds of logical moves. So here's their layout of the argument from the poverty of the stimulus, which they call APS. I'm calling it POS. Same thing. Right? First, human infants learn their languages either by data-driven learning or by innately primed learning. Right? So this is a sort of basic premise that if humans are learning something about their language, then it must either come from looking at the data and figuring it out from that, empiricist learning, or from some sort of innate bias that they have in how to process their primary linguistic data. That would be universal grammar, innately primed learning, and so on and so forth. It's one or the other. And I mean, really, it's probably both, but for any particular thing they're learning, it's going to be one or the other. That's the premise. Okay, so with that in place, we can say that if human infants acquire their first languages via data-driven learning, and not via innately primed stuff, then it must be the case that they can't learn anything for which they lack crucial evidence, right? That's what data-driven learning is. If you don't have evidence for the structure-dependent generalization in your linguistic input, then you shouldn't be able to learn it if learning is data-driven. The poverty of the stimulus argument then generally relies on the following moves. But infants do, in fact, learn things for which they lack crucial evidence, right? Here's the auxiliary fronting phenomenon. Here's backwards binding sentences, so on and so forth. Therefore, we can conclude that human infants don't learn their first languages entirely by means of data-driven learning. So there is some aspect of, as in E here, innately primed learning as well. So it is not only data-driven learning that drives language acquisition. There must also be innate biases. This is the Pullum and Scholz breakdown of this argument, which I think is pretty well done. Right? These are the crucial parts here. And then to justify some of these moves within this argument, you require certain forms of evidence, right? And this is another Pullum and Scholz breakdown of what kinds of stuff you need to specify in order to make a valid argument from the poverty of the stimulus. The first thing they call an acquirendum, the thing that is to be acquired. And so you have to first describe in detail what's alleged to be known. Right? So, for instance, the auxiliary fronting facts of English. Right? Then you have to specify what they call the lacuna. So it's a set of sentences such that if the learner could hear those sentences, then they'd be able to learn this from the data, and the claim of data-driven learning would be supported. You have to additionally show that those data are indispensable for learning, right? So if learning were data-driven, then you could not possibly get the acquirendum without having access to the sentences in the lacuna. Then you have to show that tokens of the sentences in the lacuna were in fact not available to the learner during the acquisition process. And finally, you have to show that nonetheless, even though they didn't have access to these crucial sentences in the lacuna, they did still in fact get the acquirendum. Right? So these are all the pieces that you need to have a valid argument from the poverty of the stimulus, according to Pullum and Scholz. And they go through a whole bunch of cases that they've sort of singled out in different kinds of linguistics literature, trying to show that they fail one or more of these criteria. And a number of the ones they pick out are pretty marginal or ones that I had never even heard of, and things that pretty clearly are not very well argued. And so I'm going to mostly ignore those, except to point out that, yeah, there's some sloppy poverty of the stimulus arguments out there. But the most interesting one, to my mind, that they take on here is this auxiliary fronting argument, because it seems to me to be one of the stronger poverty of the stimulus arguments. Here's how they apply these categories or these specifications to that argument. The acquirendum here will be the structure-dependent generalization about auxiliary initial clauses. That is, Auxiliary initial clauses, things like yes, no questions, is the man who is tall in the hallway. They differ from subject initial clauses, that is, declaratives, in the position of the main clause, auxiliary. Right? So the man who is tall is in the hallway. Is the man who is tall in the hallway? So that's the thing that needs to be acquired. The lacuna here, the set of crucial sentences which provide evidence, uh, is going to be the set of all sentences in which the initial auxiliary in an auxiliary initial clause is not the first auxiliary in the corresponding declarative clause. Right? In other words, it's going to be these super complex yes-no questions across a subject-relative clause, as in, is the man who is tall in the hallway? The indispensability argument here is that evidence that distinguishes between the structure-dependent and structure-independent hypotheses, which would be evidence of auxiliary initial sentences in which the clause initial auxiliary is not the first auxiliary in the related declarative, is needed to learn this acquirendum because on other types of sentences, the two make exactly the same predictions. Right? These would be cases like, is the toy over there? Where either the structure dependent or the structure independent generalization would predict the right form there. It's only in the complicated ones where you have an extra auxiliary that's deeply embedded but at the beginning of the sentence that you get different predictions out of the two theories. So it's indispensable to have those super complex sentences in your input if you want to acquire the right rule of English auxiliary fronting. This is a valid point. Pullum and Scholz note that nobody's actually offered evidence that you don't get sentences of that sort in your early linguistic input. Right? So maybe kids are hearing complex yes-no questions across subject-relative clauses with auxiliaries in them every day. Maybe they're hearing thousands of them or something. Nobody's ever offered any evidence that it's actually impossible to get these sentences during your early linguistic input. Chomsky asserts that utterances in which a clause has an initial auxiliary that would not be first in the corresponding declarative are so rare that a person might go through much or all of his life without ever having been exposed to them. Or that you can go over a vast amount of data of experience, that is child-directed speech basically, without ever finding such a case. And these tend to be the kinds of statements that Chomsky makes here. He doesn't bother doing experiments or going into a corpus and actually demonstrating that these things are incredibly rare. He introspects, he thinks about it for a minute and says, there's no way that kids are getting those sentences. And Pullum and Scholz point out, and this is a valid point, that, at some point it's been, at this point, 50 years since Chomsky started writing about this stuff. We should really have some evidence by now from actual examinations of child-directed speech, yet we don't. Right? So that's a valid point. They're attacking the inaccessibility evidence here. And the acquisition evidence is, again, not attempted by Chomsky, but Crane and Nakayama, which we talked about in the last lecture, they provide experimental confirmation that children do, in fact, learn this acquirendum by roughly 3 or 3.5 years of age. Right? And so the only part of the argument they're really attacking here is this part, the inaccessibility evidence. So in this particular case, they're claiming that, everything about this poverty of the stimulus argument might be right, but nobody's shown that kids don't get exposed to this stuff. Pullum and Scholz also note another reason to doubt that inaccessibility argument, because they point out that actually you could learn the structure-dependent generalization from sentences that are a little bit broader than only yes-no questions. And in particular, in English, WH questions take the main clause auxiliary with them when they move to the front of a sentence. So in these examples, this is not a yes-no question. It's a WH question, even though how doesn't technically start with WH. How could anyone who is awake not hear that? Here, the auxiliary could has moved from this position. Anyone who is awake could not hear that. How? Right? The auxiliary has moved from here, even though there's an earlier auxiliary in the sentence. You can't move this auxiliary. How is anyone who awake could not hear that? ungrammatical in English. So this works actually more or less just like the yes-no questions, but here's a way to get evidence also from WH questions. Another example here using when will the man who is in charge be back? Right? And here, this will modal has moved from the main clause, even though it follows the auxiliary in this subject relative clause. The man who is in charge will be back when. It's will that moves here, and not is. This is ungrammatical. When is the man who in charge will be back? So Pullum and Scholz point out that, first of all, nobody's ever shown any evidence that we don't get lacuna sentences like these. And second of all, there's a broader variety of sentences in the lacuna than people have said previously. It's not only yes-no questions that can help you learn this structure-dependent generalization from your linguistic input. It's also these kinds of WH questions. So their next move here is going to be to show, actually, they're not so inaccessible after all. You can find all sorts of relevant sentences that would allow you to learn this generalization in, things that kids typically look at, like the Wall Street Journal. How fundamental are the changes these events portend? The changes these events portend are how fundamental. Where I'm not exactly sure what you would have moved out of the subject relative clause here. There doesn't seem to be an auxiliary, but presumably if it's empty, you get do support, as you would in most English questions. So this is at least marginally relevant. Here's a very simple sentence that seems to be characteristic of what young children get exposed to. Is a young professional who lives in a bachelor condo as much a part of the middle class as a family in the suburbs? So I'm joking around a bit here. The point is, I'm not sure why they're bringing in all these data from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, nobody is disputing the fact that in adult English, this is the way to produce these questions. But this doesn't seem totally relevant to child input. And then they start moving into even more exotic things here. So this is an Oscar Wilde play. Who is that young person whose hand my nephew Algernon is now holding in what seems to me a peculiarly unnecessary manner? And again, here, I mean, this is not really relevant to the question under debate. We're talking about 3 and 3.5-year-old children here. They presumably have not seen the importance of being earnest. This is the 70s television show Mork and Mindy, the poetry of William Blake. And Pullum, I think, notes here that he was read this poem as a young English child. And, that must be totally typical. Did he who made the lamb make thee? Again, so you could see these as being marginally relevant to the auxiliary fronting phenomenon, but not at all clear that these are relevant to English learning children other than Jeff Pullum. They do finally produce a couple relevant examples from actual child-directed speech in this corpus that's referred to as Childes, and it's one of the first big corpora of child-directed speech and child-produced speech in linguistics. It comes out, I think, in the 1980s or 90s, and it becomes widely available. And you can just search all of these databases to see what kinds of sentences children have been exposed to in this particular sample. Right? Here's what they find, and they say, look, we just looked at 2 tracks in this Childes corpus. We just picked 2. There's lots and lots and lots of different children and lots of different CD tracks they were at the time, like 15-minute intervals. We just picked 2 at random, and we found 3 of these questions in there. So here's one. Where's the little blue crib that was in the house before? Now, presumably, the corresponding declarative is the little blue crib that was in the house before is there, or is where. Right? You don't extract this was, even though it's earlier in the sentence. You extract the main clause is, which is realized as a clitic here, z. Right? Similarly, all of these are where's questions. Where's the other dolly that was in here? It's not where was the other dolly that in here is, or something like that. That would be the ungrammatical version. We're getting the grammatical version. The structure-dependent generalization is active in these examples. So this is their sort of gotcha moment. Hey, look, if you search an actual corpus of child-directed speech, you do find relevant sentences for learning the structure-dependent generalization. And claims that children don't see these crucial sentences, that they're not exposed to the sentences in the lacuna, they're just wrong. Those claims are empirical claims that are empirically wrong. Uh, Therefore, auxiliary fronting can be learned from primary linguistic data. No innate bias is required to learn this. And the poverty of the stimulus argument, this thing that's been celebrated since at least the mid 1960s from Chomsky's work, doesn't actually go through even for its most famous case, which is this auxiliary fronting case. It just doesn't work, right? This is their conclusion. And at first you look at this and it seems like a pretty convincing case, and we sort of knew it was problematic, that Chomsky and others are just saying, well, kids never see these relative clause questions, therefore they couldn't have learned this from the data. And the question is, well, how do you know that, right? And here Pullum and Scholz seem to have shown that actually kids do see these sentences, therefore you don't need any innate bias at all. Then come Legate and Yang, and they will question all of these conclusions of Pullum and Scholz. And yeah, we'll see how in a moment. So first, they're going to argue that Pullum and Scholz's critique of this auxiliary fronting example is off base. They also complain about the tone of the paper and such, but I'm going to focus on their substantive arguments. It seems very clear that these sets of authors do not like each other, but that's really not the interesting part here. There is an interesting actual discussion of the poverty of the stimulus argument here. So what's wrong with Pullum and Scholz's argument, according to Legate and Yang? Well, they grossly mischaracterize the relevant data, and they ignore the amount of data that would be needed to learn auxiliary fronting. And as a sort of aside here, this is not the main point, but it's interesting to think about. They also play down, according to Legate and Yang, the size of the hypothesis space that a child has to search in order to learn this rule. So I'll start with that, even though it's sort of peripheral. What do we mean by hypothesis space? Well, they're sort of pretending that, actually, okay, I'll get to that on the next slide. First, here's Legate and Yang reviewing. So given some primary linguistic data D that you've been exposed to as a child, and a simple but incorrect hypothesis about D, and we'll call that one H, and here that's going to be something like the structure-independent front the first auxiliary hypothesis. The child behaves as though he or she does not entertain H, even though the evidence necessary to rule H out, the lacuna in Pullum and Scholz's terms, is not available to the child. Therefore, and this little triangle of dots is from formal logic, it means therefore, the child possesses innate knowledge excluding hypothesis H from the hypothesis space. So the hypothesis space here is the idea that when you begin acquiring a language as an infant, there's many possible forms that your language might take. Each of those is kind of a hypothesis, and you have to figure out in this giant space of nearly endless hypotheses about what your language might be like, which one is the right hypothesis. So you're searching this space in the analogy from the computational theory of mind. Right? The kinds of data that everybody agrees that children probably are exposed to are things like these in A, B, and C. Is Alex singing a song where the E here indicates an empty syntactic slot where the auxiliary is moved from? So Alex is singing a song. Is Alex singing a song? Robin has finished reading. Has Robin finished reading? And so the first thing they point out is that actually the number of hypotheses to entertain here is not 2. Right? Pullum and Scholz treat this as if there's exactly 2 hypotheses we need to consider about auxiliary fronting. One of them is front the first auxiliary, and the other one is front the auxiliary from the matrix syntactic clause closest to the root of the constituent structure of the syntactic sentence. Right? Actually, as Legate and Yang point out, there's hundreds or thousands or millions of possible hypotheses that you could formulate about phenomena like this. So here's some linear ones. From sentences like this, you could get front the first auxiliary. You could get front the last auxiliary. You could get front all of the auxiliaries or something like that. You could get linear and hierarchical ones that mix hierarchical syntactic structure along with the order of words. So structure dependent plus structure independent ones. Front the first auxiliary following the first noun phrase in the sentence. Right? Front the first auxiliary preceding some kind of a verb phrase in the sentence. These are going to be equally wrong, excuse me, as the simple linear ones, but they're going to also involve syntactic structure. There's an almost unlimited number of hypotheses you could state that would explain these kinds of data. Right? So you'd have to rule out not just front the first auxiliary, but all of these other ones as well in order to have correctly learned the English auxiliary fronting phenomenon. Here's some what they call creative ones. These are just weird, right? So front the auxiliary whose position in the sentence is a prime number. Here, 2 is a prime number, 2 is a prime number, 3 is a prime number. Therefore, maybe that's the right analysis. And obviously, nobody thinks that children are entertaining this as a hypothesis or that it needs to be ruled out. But if that's your position, that children don't ever consider rules like front the auxiliary whose position in the sentence is a prime number, that has to be ruled out by something. And an innate bias on which aspects of syntactic structure you pay attention to would do that. Here's another weird one. Front the auxiliary which most closely follows a noun. Right? Again, you'd have to rule that out in order to get the right generalization. It's not just front the first auxiliary. It's any number of simple yet incorrect hypotheses about how auxiliary fronting works. Right? Crane and Nakayama show that children don't make the following errors, the ones in A and B here. Is the woman who's singing is happy? Is the man that reading a book has eaten supper? We found that children do make some errors on these questions, certainly. They're very complex, but not these errors, right? Which is interesting. Therefore, they can't be entertaining any of these hypotheses. The linear ones, the linear and hierarchical ones, the creative ones, none of these apparently are coming into play because children are not entertaining any of these. They're not making the errors that these would predict. All of these hypotheses would predict these errors, and we don't find children making them. So that's them critiquing the idea that Pullum and Scholz have that the hypothesis space is really just two hypotheses. Legate and Yang were pointing out, actually, there's an infinite number of hypotheses you'd need to rule out. And without some kind of constraints on what your syntactic learning space looks like, there's absolutely no way to rule out anything. You can't have any learning at all without some kind of innate structure. Right? The only question here is how much and what kind of innate constraint is there on the learning space. So Pullum and Scholz say, hey, actually there are ways young children could have ruled out those hypotheses from the linguistic input they've been exposed to, and they come up with these sentences from Childish. Where's the little blue crib that was in the house before? Where's the other dolly that was in here? And so on and so forth. And they estimate, based on this particular track from Childish, that the prevalence of these types of sentences in a child's linguistic input could be up to 0.1 or 1% of all the sentences they hear. So 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100 sentences, somewhere in that range, they're getting that many of these relevant lacuna sentences according to Pullum and Scholz. And if that's true, then it seems like, of course, children could learn this from the data if they're getting that many sentences of this type. Here's the thing, though. We don't know what the absolute percentage of sentences is that a child would need to be exposed to before being able to learn something, right? So we can't look at this number and say, oh, well, if they're getting 1 in 1,000 sentences of this type, they'll definitely learn it. We don't have a number like that. We just don't know that about child language acquisition. But here's what we do know. The Pullum and Scholz estimate of the frequency of these sentences, this is going to be the claim from Legate and Yang, is grossly overinflated. It's not even close to the right answer. And while we don't know how many absolute sentences or percentages of sentences you'd need to learn syntactic things, we can still use some syntactic phenomena that have to be learned, we know they're learned, to estimate how much data it requires to learn something. So they're going to use unambiguously learned syntactic stuff, things that everybody agrees are learned from primary linguistic data, to estimate, hey, how much input does a child require to learn this kind of thing? And the claim there is going to be that it's far, far more than children are exposed to for the auxiliary fronting phenomenon. So let's see how this works. First, they get a real frequency estimate. Instead of picking out one particular track in Childis that has a whole bunch of these complex WH questions with auxiliary fronting, Legate and Yang count every single sentence in the Nina subcorpus, which is where they, Pullum and Scholz pulled these sentences from, is this one child's data, but only one part of it. Legate and Yang count the whole corpus for that child, and they add in a second one for good measure. They find that the actual prevalence of these yes-no questions and WH questions showing auxiliary fronting across another auxiliaries, the actual lacuna sentences, the ones that Pullum and Scholz are pointing to and saying, ha, gotcha. For yes-no questions, the probability of observing one of these is 0 for either child. And for the WH examples that Pullum and Scholz use here, their actual prevalence is several orders of magnitude lower than what Pullum and Scholz suggested is, right? So I can't even get this. This is 6800 thousandths for Nina and 4500 thousandths for Adam, right? Extremely, extremely rare. Okay, well, so whatever. So they're actually rarer than we thought, and maybe Pullum and Scholz were being sloppy, and actually Legate and Yang imply that they were being dishonest by cherry picking the most useful tracks out of the corpus, but whatever, so what? So they're very low frequency. That doesn't mean kids can't learn from these frequencies. We don't know how many sentences kids would need to hear to learn this kind of thing, which is where Legate and Yang say, aha, but we can estimate it, and we'd estimate it by checking how often they need to hear syntactic things in general in order to learn them by 3 years old or so. That's the age that Crane and Nakayama investigated. They found that 3-year-olds pretty clearly weren't considering the structure-independent hypothesis. How are we going to get that estimate? Well, we'll look at syntactic things that are clearly and uncontroversially learned, in particular, that are uncontroversially learned around 3 years old. How do we know that things must be learned from primary linguistic data? Well, at a first pass, anything that's different across different languages is something that has to be learned from your environment. So let's look at things that differ across languages and see what age children acquire those things. If we can find things that are learned around 3 years old, then we'll know, here's how much data you need to learn something by 3 years old. So here's the first example they use, subject prodrop. And this is a general property in some languages. Whenever you have a pronoun in subject position, you can pretty much always drop that pronoun. Now in English, you can do this occasionally in some rhetorical contexts, but not in the general case. So for a sentence like, he cleaned the kitchen, in the usual case, it's not optional to include that pronoun he. That has to be here. If you omit it, as in cleaned the kitchen, that is ungrammatical for this sentence in English. Now, if you walk into a room and say, cleaned the kitchen, there's sort of an implicit first person pronoun there, I cleaned the kitchen, but that's very different than other languages with productive prodrop in subject position, as in Spanish. Here you get cleaned the kitchen, limpió la cocina, and the inflection on this verb says that some third person singular thing cleaned the kitchen. Could be him, could be her, depends on the context. But you can absolutely drop the subject pronoun here. It's optional. The pronoun, if it were present, would be él limpió la cocina. But in most cases, you just drop it. So that's subject prodrop. Now, if we're going to end up with the correct English and Spanish grammars as English and Spanish learning infants, then me growing up in Boston, Massachusetts is going to have to learn somehow that we don't do this. And my friend Loriani growing up in Puerto Rico is going to have to learn that we do this, right? How are children going to figure that out? From listening to the language being spoken around them. English learning children often start out allowing pro-drop, right, or using pro-drop, but they stop doing it around age 3. Right? So how are English learning children figuring out that the language being spoken around them is English and not Spanish? What are they going to use as crucial evidence that we don't allow subject pro-drop in English? Think about this for a minute and see if you can come up with an answer. We're going to need something that shows unambiguously that English sentences are required to have subjects, even when the referent is sort of known from the context. What kind of evidence would be ambiguous there? Because remember, this sequence with the overt pronoun is also allowed in Spanish. This doesn't distinguish between the two languages. We need evidence that you can't ever drop a subject pronoun in English under any circumstances. For those of you who've taken syntax, this is going to be the same evidence that we use to justify the EPP in syntax, the principle that all English sentences must have overt subjects. So think of that if you can. Here it is. The crucial evidence that pro-drop is prohibited in English is going to be expletive subjects. Now in syntax, expletive has this special meaning. It's a pronominal form that has no referent, basically has no meaning. Right? So in English, there is one type of expletive that is a locative there, but it doesn't have any location meaning, right? So in a statement like, there are 27 countries in Europe, right, you're not pointing at something and saying there, right? You're just using something to fill the subject position of these sentences. In Spanish, where you don't require subjects in these tensed clauses, you don't need an expletive there. And in fact, you can't have one. So in Spanish, you can't substitute in the locative there, allí, allá, or any other form of locative in order to fill that subject position. There just is no subject in these sentences. In English, there is, because, again, even when there's no meaning that has to be associated with an argument in subject position, you still have to put something in there in English, because we can't drop subjects in English. This is unambiguous evidence. Now, you might think that it-type expletives, as in, it's possible that Europe has too few countries or something like that. That could also be evidence, although the claim is that basically those are always going to be ambiguous in English between pronominal it or argument bearing it and expletive it, whereas this expletive there is really pretty unambiguous evidence that you need to pop something into subject position. So English learning children are figuring this out, that we can't do pro-drop by age 3, roughly. They have to be using these lacuna to figure it out, their type expletives. How frequent are those? They're in about 1.2% of the sentences in the child as corpus. So they're about 20 times more frequent than the complex auxiliary fronting examples that Pullum and Scholz used. Of course, if you think it-type expletives are also relevant here and could help English children learn this from the input, then we would expect this 1.2% figure to be even higher, much higher probably, in which case we would say that they need a huge amount more data than Pullum and Scholz have located in order to actually learn syntactic phenomena from their primary linguistic data by age 3, right? Much, much more data for things that have been learned than there are for these complex auxiliary fronting examples. Here's another case that Legate and Yang go through. And this is the example of so-called V2 phenomena in Germanic languages. So for instance, in German and Dutch, this works slightly different in every Germanic language, but German would be the paradigm case here. What you find in simple declarative sentences is that one syntactic phrase always precedes the verb, but there's a fair bit of freedom over which phrase it is, right? So it's usually the subject. That would give you the same word order as in English, right? The man saw the movie. But it can also be an object. You can get OVS, object, verb, subject order in these languages as well. So it's possible to say the movie saw the man with the meaning that in English, the man saw the movie. Right? You can't put the verb third, though. It has to be in second position here. So you can't do the man the movie saw. This is so-called V2 or verb second phenomena. When did German learning and Dutch learning children show adult-like V2 patterns? Right at the same age, about 3 to 3.5 years, which is the crucial age that we've been interested in here. So again, how are German learning children going to acquire this V2 phenomenon? What's the crucial evidence here? Think about that for a sec. The thing that they need to acquire is that one syntactic phrase always precedes the verb, and it can be any syntactic phrase. If you just get the default subject-verb-object pattern, that's not going to prove that what's going on here, because if in that case, it could just be English, where we don't have V2, and so we wouldn't expect just the SVO sentences to be relevant here, because English learning children are exposed to those too, yet they don't acquire V2. So the German and Dutch learning children must be exposed to some other pattern that teaches them that, in fact, it's optional what appears before the verb, but there just has to be something. And so the crucial evidence for these simple transitive sentences, anyway, is going to be the object-verb-subject pattern. Right? That's the crucial evidence here. What's the frequency of these sentences in German and Dutch childis? So they also have German and Dutch versions of these corpora. It's almost exactly the same as the expletive there sentences in English, about 1.2%. Which is, again, about 20 times more frequent than complex auxiliary fronting examples that arguably could help you learn the English auxiliary fronting rule from the data. And again, this is overly conservative because there's actually a whole bunch of other kinds of syntactic constituents in German and Dutch that can precede the verb. So if you have something like, he saw the movie yesterday, you can also have that adjunct yesterday as the first element in a V2 sentence, and they're not even counting those. They're just focusing on this, the simple patterns here. And so even with just counting these OVS sentences, they're way, way more frequent than the kinds of things you'd need to learn auxiliary fronting. So again, what are we showing here? Well, we have a bunch of things that we know children learn around 3 or 3.5 years, just like auxiliary fronting, and the kinds of crucial evidence they get for those things tend to be orders of magnitude more common than the kinds of data they get that bear on auxiliary fronting. This is what we're showing here. So the conclusions, yeah, sure, maybe children hear a couple complex auxiliary fronting examples, but they don't hear those at anything near the rate or the amount required for learning something syntactic by 36 months. We know this because we looked at syntactic things that are learned around 36 months, and they have much, much higher rates of relevant data than the auxiliary fronting one does. Because English learning children nevertheless learn the correct rule of auxiliary fronting, the original poverty of the stimulus argument stands. At least that's Legate and Yang's conclusion. As a side note here, there's a lot of sort of sneering in the Pullum Scholz paper about Chomsky's impressionistic formulations and casual statements that children never hear these things. But it's worth noting that when you actually look in the Childis corpus, these impressionistic statements about the vanishing rarity of complex auxiliary fronting, those appear to be more or less correct. So we found yes-no questions of this type 0 times in the 67,000 sentences in these two corpora. So laugh at Chomsky if you want, but what you actually find when you look in the corpus is that his intuitions were basically correct. Now, of course, if you expand the corpus infinitely to millions and millions of sentences, will you occasionally find a complex auxiliary fronting yes-no question? Presumably, yes. Is that anywhere near enough data for an English acquiring child to actually learn the structure dependence of this rule? Probably not. So that's the conclusion of Legate and Yang. Next, we'll take a look at one other kind of structure-dependent syntactic generalization that's generated a fair bit of controversy, just like this one, a back and forth about how you may or may not learn this kind of thing from the data.